Theodore Roosevelt, an Autobiography. Chapter 2. The Vigor of Life. Looking back, a man really has a more objective feeling about himself as a child than he has about his father or mother. He feels as if that child were not the present he, individually, but an ancestor. Just as much an ancestor as either of his parents. The saying that the child is the father to the man may be taken in a sense almost the reverse of that usually given to it. The child is a father to the man in the sense that his individuality is separate from the individuality of the grown-up into which he turns. This is perhaps one reason why a man can speak of his childhood and early youth with a sense of detachment. Having been a sickly boy, with no natural bodily prowess, and having lived much at home, I was at first quite unable to hold my own when thrown into contact with other boys of rougher antecedents. I was nervous and timid, yet from reading of the people I admired, ranging from the soldiers of Valley Forge and Morgan's riflemen to the heroes of my stories, and from hearing of the feats performed by my southern forefathers and kinsfolk, and from knowing my father, I felt a great admiration for men who were fearless and who could hold their own in the world, and I had a great desire to be like them. Until I was nearly 14, I let this desire take no more definite shape than daydreams. Then an incident happened that did me real good. Having an attack of asthma, I was sent off by myself to Moosehead Lake. On the stagecoach ride thither I encountered a couple of other boys who were about my own age, but very much more competent and also much more mischievous. I have no doubt they were good-hearted boys, but they were boys. They found that I was a foreordained and predestined victim, and industriously proceeded to make life miserable for me. The worst feature was that when I finally tried to fight them, I discovered that either one singly could not only handle me with easy contempt, but handle me so as to not hurt me much, and yet prevent my doing any damage whatever in return. The experience taught me that probably no amount of good advice could have been taught me. I made up my mind that I must try to learn, so that I would not again be put in such a helpless position. And having become quickly and bitterly conscious that I did not have the natural prowess to hold my own, I decided that I would try to supply its place by boxing. Accordingly, with my father's hearty approval, I started to learn to box. I was a painfully slow and awkward pupil, and certainly worked 2 or 3 years before I made any perceptible improvement whatever. My first boxing master was John Long, an ex-prize fighter. I can see his rooms now, with colored pictures of the fights between Tom Hyler and Yankee Sullivan, and Heenan and Sayers, and other great events in the annals of the squared circle. On one occasion, to excite interest among his patrons, he held a series of championship matches for the different weights, the prizes being, at least in my own class, pewter mugs of a value, I should suppose, approximately 50 cents. Neither he nor I had any idea that I could do anything, but I entered in the lightweight contest, in which it happened that I was pitted in succession against a couple of reedy striplings who were even worse than I was. Equally to their surprise, and to my own, and to John Long's, I won, and the pewter mug became one of my most prized possessions. I kept it, and alluded to it, and I fear bragged about it, for a number of years, and I only wish I knew where it was now. Years later I read an account of a little man who once in a fifth-rate handicap race won a worthless pewter medal, and enjoyed it ever after. Well, as soon as I read that story I felt that little man and I were brothers. This was, as far as I remember, the only one of my exceedingly rare athletic triumphs, which would be worth relating. I did a good deal of boxing and wrestling in Harvard, but never attained to the first rank in either, even at my own weight. Once, in the big contests in the gym, I got either in the finals or semifinals, I forget which. But aside from this, the chief part I played was to act as trial horse for some friend or classmate who did have a chance of distinguishing himself in the championship contests. I was fond of horseback riding, but I took to it slowly, and with difficulty, exactly as with boxing. It was a long time before I even became a respectable rider, and never got much higher. I mean by this that I never became a first-flight man in the hunting field, and never even approached the bronco-busting class in the West. Any man, if he chooses, can gradually school himself to the requisite nerve, and gradually learn the requisite seat and hands, that will enable him to do respectably across country, or to perform the average work on a ranch. Of my ranch experiences, I shall speak later. At intervals after leaving college, I hunted on Long Island with the Meadowbrook Hounds. Almost the only experience I ever had in this connection that was of any interest was on one occasion when I broke my arm. My purse did not permit me to own expensive horses. On this occasion, I was riding an animal, a buggy horse originally, which its owner sold because now and then it insisted on thoughtfully lying down when in harness. It never did this under the saddle, and when he turned it out to grass it would solemnly hop over the fence and get somewhere where it did not belong. The last trait that was coveted into a hunter. It was a natural jumper, although without any speed. On the hunting question I got along very well until the pace winded my ex-buggy horse, and it turned a somersault over a fence. When I got on it after the fall, I found I could not use my left arm. I supposed it was merely a strain. The buggy horse was a sedate animal, which I rode with a snaffle. So we pounded along at the trail of the hunt, and I did not appreciate that my arm was broken for 3 or 4 fences. Then we came to a big drop, and the jar made the bones slip past one another as to throw the hand out of position. It did not hurt me at all, and as the horse was as easy to ride as a rocking chair, I got in at the death. I think August Belmont was the master of the hunt when the above incident occurred. I know he was master on another occasion on which I met with a mild adventure. On one of the hunts, when I was out, a man was thrown, dragged by one stirrup, and killed. In consequence, I bought a pair of safety stirrups, which I used the next time I went out. Within 5 minutes after the run began, I found that the stirrups were so very safe that they would not stay in at all. First one went off at one jump, and then the other at another jump, with a fall for me on each occasion. I hated to give up the fun so early, and accordingly finished the run without any stirrups. My horse never went as fast as on that run. Doubtless a first-class horseman can ride as well without stirrups as with them, but I was not a first-class horseman. When anything unexpected happened, I was apt to clasp the solemn buggy horse firmly with my spurred heels, and the result was that he laid himself out to the best in the way of galloping. He speedily found that, thanks to the snaffle bit, I could not pull him in, so when he came to a downgrade he would usually put on steam. Then, if there was a fence at the bottom and he checked at all, I was apt to shoot forward, and in such event we went over the fence in a way that reminded me of Leech's picture in Punch of Mr. Tom Noddy, and his mare jumping a fence in the following order: Mr. Tom Noddy, 1, his mare, 2. However, I got in at the death this time also. I was fond of walking and climbing. As a lad, I used to go to the North Woods in Maine, both in fall and winter. There I made life friends of 2 men, Will Doe and Bill Sewell. I canoed with them, and tramped through the woods with them, visiting the winter logging camps on snowshoes. Afterward they were with me in the West. Will Doe was dead. Bill Sewell was a collector of customs under me on the Aroostook border. Except when hunting, I never did any mountaineering save for a couple of conventional trips up the Matterhorn and the Jungfrau on one occasion when I was in Switzerland. I never did much with the shotgun, but I practiced a good deal with the rifle. I had a rifle range at Sagamore Hill, where I often took friends to shoot. Once or twice, when I was visited by parties of released Boer prisoners after the close of the South African War, they and I held shooting matches together. The best man with both pistol and rifle who ever shot there was Stuart Edward White. Among the many other good men was a stanch friend, Baron Speck von Sternberg, afterwards German ambassador at Washington during my presidency. He was a capital shot, rider, and walker, a devoted and most efficient servant of Germany, who had fought with distinction in the Franco-German War, when barely more than a boy. He was the hero of the story of The Pig Dog in Archibald Forbes's volume of reminiscences. It was he who first talked over with me the raising of a regiment of rifle horsemen from among the ranchmen and cowboys of the plains. When ambassador, the poor, gallant, tender-hearted fellow was dying of a slow and painful disease, so that he could not play with the rest of us, but the agony of his mortal illness never in the slightest degree interfered with his work. Among the other men who shot and rode and walked with me was Cecil Spring Rice, who has just been appointed the British ambassador to the United States. He was my groomsman, my best man, when I was married, at St. George's, Hanover Square, which made me feel as if I were living in one of Thackeray's novels. My own experience as regards marksmanship was much the same as my experience as the regards of horsemanship. There are men whose eye and hand are as quick and so sure that they achieve a perfection of marksmanship to which no practice will enable ordinary men to obtain. There are other men who cannot learn to shoot with any accuracy at all. In between come the mass of men of ordinary abilities who, if they choose resolutely to practice, can by sheer industry and judgment make themselves fair rifle shots. The men who show this requisite industry and judgment can without special difficulty raise themselves to the second class of respectable rifle shots, and it is to this class that I belong. But to have reached this point of marksmanship with a rifle at a target by no means implies ability to hit game in the field, especially dangerous game. All kinds of other qualities, moral and physical, enter into which a good hunter, and especially a good hunter after dangerous game, just as all kinds of other qualities in addition to skill with the rifle enter into being a good soldier. With dangerous game, after a fair degree of efficiency with the rifle has been attained, the prime requisites are cool judgment and that kind of nerve which consists in avoiding being rattled. Any beginner is apt to have buck fever, and therefore no beginner should go at dangerous game. Buck fever means a state of intense nervous excitement which may be entirely divorced from timidity. It may affect a man the first time he has to speak to a large audience, just as it affects him the first time he sees a buck or goes into battle. What such a man needs is not courage but nerve control, cool-headedness. This he can get only by actual practice. He must, by custom and repeated exercise of self-mastery, get his nerves thoroughly under control. This is largely a matter of habit, in the sense of repeated effort and repeated exercise of willpower. If the man has the right stuff in him, his will grows stronger and stronger with each exercise of it, and if he has not the right stuff in him, he had better keep clear of dangerous game hunting, or indeed any other form of sport or work in which there is bodily peril. After he has achieved the ability to exercise wariness and judgment and the control over his nerves, which will make him shoot as well at the game as at a target, he can begin his essays at dangerous game hunting, and he will then find that it does not demand such abnormal prowess as the outsider is apt to imagine. A man who can hit a soda water bottle at a distance of a few yards can brain a lion or a bear or an elephant at the same distance. And if he cannot brain it when it charges, he can at least bring it to a standstill. All he has to do is to shoot as accurately as he would at a soda water bottle. And to do this requires nerve, at least as much as it does physical address. Having reached this point, the hunter must not imagine that he is warranted in taking desperate chances. There are degrees in proficiency, and what is warrantable and legitimate risk for a man to take when he has reached a certain grade of efficiency may be a foolish risk for him to take before he has reached that grade. A man who has reached the grade of proficiency indicated above is quite warranted in walking in at a line at bay, in an open field, in an open plain, to say, within 100 yards. If the lion has not charged, the man ought at that distance to knock him over and prevent his charging, and if the lion is already charging, the man ought at that distance be able to stop him. But the amount of prowess which warrants a man in relying on his ability to perform this feat does not by any means justify him in thinking that, for an instance, he can crawl after a wounded lion into thick cover. I have known men of indifferent prowess to perform this latter feat successfully, but at least as often they have been unsuccessful, and in these cases the result has been unpleasant. The man who habitually follows wounded lions into thick cover must be a hunter of the highest skill, or he can count with certainty of an ultimate mauling. The first 2 or 3 bucks I ever saw gave me buck fever badly, but after I had gained experience with ordinary game, I never had buck fever at all with dangerous game. In my case, the overcoming of buck fever was the result of conscious effort and a deliberate determination to overcome it. More happily constituted men never have to make the determined effort at all, which may perhaps show that the average man can profit more from the experiences than he can from those of the exceptional man. I have shot only 5 kinds of animal which can fairly be called dangerous game, that is, the lion, elephant, rhinoceros, and buffalo in Africa, and the big grizzly bear a quarter of a century ago in the Rockies. Taking into account not only my personal experience, but the experiences of many veteran hunters, I regard all the 4 African animals, but especially the lion, elephant, and buffalo, much more dangerous than the grizzly. As it happened, however, the only narrow escape I personally ever had was from a grizzly, and in Africa the animal killed closest to me as it was charging was a rhinoceros. All of which goes to show that a man must not generalize too broadly from his own personal experiences. On the whole, I think the lion the most dangerous of all these 5 creatures. That is, I think that, if fairly hunted, there is a larger percentage of hunters killed or mauled for a given number of lions killed than for a given number of any one of the other animals. Yet, I personally had no difficulties with lions. I twice killed lions which were at bay and just starting to charge, and I killed a heavily maned male while it was in full charge. But in each instance I had plenty of leeway, the animal being so far off that even if my bullet had not been fatal, I should have had time for a couple of more shots. The American buffalo is undoubtedly a dangerous beast, but it happened that the few that I shot did not charge. A bull elephant, a vicious rogue, which had been killing people in the native villages, did charge before being shot at. My son Kermit and I stopped it at 40 yards. Another bull elephant, also unwounded which charged, nearly got me, and I had just fired both cartridges from my heavy double-barreled rifle in killing the bull I was after. The first wild elephant I had ever seen. The second bull came through the thick brush to my left like a steam plow through a light snowdrift, everything snapping before his rush, and was so near that he could have hit me with his trunk. I slipped past him behind a tree. People have asked me how I felt on this occasion. My answer has always been that I suppose I felt as most men of like experience feel on such occasions. At such a moment, a hunter is so very busy that he has no time to get frightened. He wants to get in his cartridges and try another shot. Rhinoceros are truculent, blustering beasts, much the most stupid of all the dangerous game I know. Generally, their attitude is one of mere stupidity and bluff, but on occasions they do charge wickedly, both when wounded and when entirely unprovoked. The first I ever shot I mortally wounded at a few rods' distance, and it charged with the utmost determination, whereat I and my companion both fired, and more by good luck than anything else brought it to the ground just 13 paces from where we stood. Another rhinoceros may or may not have been meaning to charge me. I have never been certain which. It heard us and came at us through rather thick brush, snorting and tossing its head. I am by no means sure that it had fixedly hostile intentions, and indeed with my present experience I think likely that if I had not fired, it would have flinched at the last moment and either retreated or gone by me. But I am not a rhinoceros mind-reader, and its actions were such as to warrant my regarding it as a suspicious character. I stopped it with a couple of bullets, and then followed it up and killed it. The skins of all these animals which I thus killed are in the National Museum at Washington. But as I said above, the only narrow escape I met with was not from one of these dangerous African animals, but from a grizzly bear. It was about 24 years ago. I had wounded the bear, just at sunset, in a wood of lodgepole pines, and, following him, I wounded him again, as he stood on the other side of a thicket. He then charged through the brush, coming with such speed and with such an irregular gait that, try as I would, I was not able to get the sight of my rifle on the brain pan, though I hit him very hard with both of the remaining barrels of my magazine Winchester. It was in the days of black powder, and the smoke hung. After my last shot, the first thing I saw was the bear's left paw, as he struck at me, so close that I made a quick movement to one side. He was, however, practically already dead, and after another jump, and while in the very act of trying to turn to come at me, he collapsed like a shot rabbit. By the way, I had a most exacerbating time trying to bring in his skin. I was alone, traveling on foot with one very docile little mountain mare for a pack pony. The little mare cared nothing for bears or anything else, so there was no difficulty in packing her. But the man without experience can hardly realize the work it was to get that bear skin off the carcass and then pack it wet, slippery, and heavy so that it would ride evenly on the pony. I was at that time fairly well versed in packing with a diamond hitch, the standby of Rocky Mountain packers in my day. But the diamond hitch is a two-man job, and even working with a squaw hitch, I got into endless trouble with that wet and slippery bearskin. With infinite labor, I would get the skin on the pony and run the ropes over it, until to all seeming it was fastened properly. Then off we would start, and after going about 100 yards, I would notice the hide beginning to bulge through between two ropes. I would shift one of them, and then the hide would bulge somewhere else. I would shift the rope again, and still the hide would flow slowly out as if it was lava. The first thing I knew, it would come down on one side, and the little mare, with her feet planted resolutely, would wait for me to perform my part by getting that bearskin back in its proper place on the McClellan saddle, which I was using as a makeshift pack saddle. The feat of killing the bear the previous day sank into nothing compared with the feat of making the bearskin ride properly as a pack on the following 3 days. The reason why I was alone in the mountains on this occasion was because, for the only time in all my experience, I had difficulty with my guide. He was a crippled old mountain man with a profound contempt for tenderfeet, a contempt that in my case was accentuated by the fact that I wore spectacles, which at that day, and in that region, were usually held to indicate a defective moral character in the wearer. He had never previously acted as a guide, or, as he expressed it, trundled a tenderfoot, and though a good hunter, who showed me much game, our experience together was not happy. He was very rheumatic, and liked to lie abed late, so that I usually had to get breakfast and, in fact, do most of the work around camp. Finally, one day he declined to go out with me, saying that he had a pain. When, that afternoon, I got back to camp, I speedily found what the pain was. We were traveling very late indeed. I have practically nothing but my buffalo sleeping bag, my wash kit, and a pair of socks. I had also taken a flask of whiskey for emergencies, although as I found that the emergencies never arose that the tea was better than whiskey when a man was cold or done out. I abandoned the practice of taking whiskey on hunting trips 20 years ago. When I got back to camp, the old fellow was sitting on a tree trunk, very erect, with his rifle across his knees, and in response to my nod of greeting, he merely leered at me. I leaned my rifle against a tree, walked over to where my bed was lying, and, happening to rummage in it for something, I found the whiskey flask was empty. I turned on him at once and accused him of having drunk it, to which he merely responded by asking what I was going to do about it. There did not seem much to do, so I said that we would part company. We were only 4 or 5 days from a settlement, and I would go in alone, taking one of the horses. He responded by cocking his rifle and saying that I could go alone and be damned to me, but I could not take any horse. I answered, all right, that if I could not, I could not, and began to move around to get some flour and salt pork. He was misled by my quietness, and by the fact that I had not in any wish resented either his actions or his language during the days we had been together, and did not watch me as closely as he ought to have done. He was sitting with the cocked rifle across his knees, the muzzle to the left. My rifle was leaning against a tree near the cooking things to his right. Managing to get near it, I whipped it up and threw the bead on him, calling, "Hands up!" He, of course, put his hands up, and then said, "Oh, come, I was only joking," to which I answered, "Well, I am not. Now straighten your legs and let your rifle go to the ground." He remonstrated, saying the rifle would go off, and I told him to let it go off. However, he straightened his legs in such a fashion that it came to the ground without a jar. I then made him move back, and picked up the rifle. By this time he was quite sober, and really did not seem angry, looking at me quizzically. He told me that if I would give him back his rifle, he would call it quits, and we could go on together. I did not think it best to trust him, so I told him that our hunt was pretty well through, anyway, and I would go home. There was a blasted pine on the trail, in plain view of the camp, about a mile off, and I told him that I would leave the rifle at that blasted pine if I could see him in camp, but that he must not come after me, for if he did, I should assume that it was with hostile intent, and would shoot. He said he had no intention of coming after me, and as he was very much crippled with rheumatism, I did not believe he would do so. Accordingly, I took the little mare, with nothing but some flour, bacon, and tea, and my bedroll, and started off. At the blasted pine I looked around, and as I could see him in camp, I left his rifle there. I then traveled till dark, and that night, for the only time in my experience, I used in camping a trick of the old-time trappers in the Indian days. I did not believe I would be followed, but still, it was not possible to be sure, so, after getting supper, While my pony fed round, I left the fire burning, repacked the mare, and pushed ahead until it literally became so dark that I could not see. Then picketed the mare, slept where I was without a fire until the first streak of dawn, and then pushed on for a couple of hours before halting to take breakfast and to let the little mare have a good feed. No plainsman needs to be told that a man should not lie near a fire if there is danger in an enemy creeping up on him, and that above all, a man should not put himself in a position where he can be ambushed at dawn. On the second day I lost the trail, and toward nightfall gave up the effort to find it, camped where I was, and went out to shoot a grouse for supper. It was while hunting in vain for a grouse that I came on the bear and killed it as above described. When I reached the settlement and went to the storekeeper identified me by remarking, "You're the tenderfoot that old Fank was trundling, ain't you?" I admitted that I was. A good many years later, after I had been elected vice president, I went on a cougar hunt in northwestern Colorado with Johnny Goff, a famous hunter and mountain man. It was midwinter. I was rather proud of my achievements and pictured myself as being known to the few settlers in the neighborhood as a successful mountain lion hunter. I could not help grinning when I found out that they did not even allude to me as the vice president-elect, let alone as a hunter, but merely as Johnny Groff's tourist. Of course, the years when I was most busy at serious work, I could do no hunting, and even my riding was of a decorous kind. But a man whose business is sedentary should get some kind of exercise if he wishes to keep himself in as good physical trim as his brethren who do manual labor. When I worked on a ranch, I needed no form of exercise except my work, but when I worked in an office, the case was different. A couple of summers I played polo with some of my neighbors. I shall always believe we played polo in just the right way for middle-aged men with stables of the general utility order. Of course, it was polo which was chiefly of interest to ourselves, the only onlookers being the members of our faithful families. My 2 ponies were the only occupants of my stable except a cart horse. My wife and I rode and drove them, and they were used for household errands and for the children. And for 2 afternoons a week, they served me as polo ponies. Polo is a good game, infinitely better for vigorous men than tennis or golf or anything of that kind. There is also the fun of football, with the horse thrown in. And if only people would be willing to play it in simple fashion, it would be almost as much within their reach as golf. But at Oyster Bay, our great and permanent amusements were rowing and sailing. I do not care for the latter, and am fond of the former. I suppose it sounds archaic, but I cannot help thinking that the people with motorboats miss a great deal. If they would only keep to rowboats or canoes, and use oar or paddle themselves, they would get infinitely more benefit than by having their work done for them by gasoline. But I rarely took exercise merely as exercise. Primarily, I took it because I liked it. Play should never be allowed to interfere with work, and a life devoted merely to play is, of all forms of existence, the most dismal. But the joy of life is a very good thing, and while work is the essential in it, play also has its place. When obliged to live in cities, I for a long time found that boxing and wrestling enabled me to get a great deal of exercise in condensed and attractive form. I was reluctantly obliged to abandon both as I grew older. I dropped the wrestling earliest. When I became governor, the champion middleweight wrestler of America happened to be in Albany, and I got him to come round 3 or 4 afternoons a week. Incidentally, I may mention that his presence caused me a difficulty with the comptroller, who refused to audit a bill I put in for a wrestling mat, explaining that I could have a billiard table, billiards being recognized as the proper national amusement, but that a wrestling mat symbolized something unusual and unheard of, and could not be permitted. The middleweight champion was, of course, so much better than I was that he could not only take care of himself, but of me too, and see that I was not hurt, for wrestling is a much more violent amusement than boxing. But after a couple of months he had to go away, and he left as substitute a good-humored, stalwart professional oarsman. The oarsman turned out to know very little about wrestling. He could not even take care of himself, not to speak of me. By the end of our second afternoon, one of his long ribs had been caved in, and 2 of my short ribs badly damaged, and my left shoulder blade so nearly shoved out of place that it creaked. He was nearly as pleased as I was when I told him I thought we would vote the war a failure, and abandon wrestling. After that I took up boxing again. While president, I used to box with some of the aides, as well as play single stick with General Wood. After a few years I had to abandon boxing as well as wrestling, for in one bout a young captain of artillery cross-countered me on the eye, and the blow smashed the little blood vessels. Fortunately it was my left eye, but the sight has been dim ever since. and if it had been the right eye, I should have been entirely unable to shoot. Accordingly, I thought it better to acknowledge that I had become an elderly man and would have to stop boxing. I then took up jiu-jitsu for a year or two. When I was in the legislature and was working very hard, with little chance of getting out of doors, all the exercise I got was boxing and wrestling. A young fellow turned up who was a second-rate prize fighter, the son of one of my old boxing teachers. For several weeks I had him come round to my rooms in the morning to put on the gloves with me for half an hour. Then he suddenly stopped, and some days later I received a letter of woe from him from jail. I found that he was by profession a burglar, and merely followed boxing as the amusement of his lighter moments, or when business was slack. Naturally, I being fond of boxing, I grew to know a good many prize fighters, and to most of those I knew I grew genuinely attached. I have never been able to sympathize with the outcry against prize fighters. The only objection I have to the prize ring is the crookedness that has attended its commercial development. Outside of this, I regard boxing, whether professional or amateur, as a first-class sport. I do not regard it as brutalizing. Of course, matches can be conducted under conditions that make them brutalizing. But this is true of football games and most other rough and vigorous sports. Most certainly, prize fighting is not half as brutalizing or demoralizing as many forms of big businesses and of the legal work carried on in connection with big business. Powerful, vigorous men of strong animal development must have some way in which their animal spirits can find vent. When I was police commissioner, I found, and Jacob Reese will back me up on this, that the establishment of a boxing club in a tough neighborhood always tended to do away with knifing and gunfighting among the young fellows who would otherwise have been in murderous gangs. Many of these young fellows were not naturally criminals at all, but they had to have some outlet for their activities. In the same way, I have always regarded boxing as a first-class sport to encourage in the Young Men's Christian Association. I do not like to see young Christians with the shoulders that slope like a champagne bottle. Of course, boxing should be encouraged in the Army and Navy. I was first drawn to two naval chaplains, Fathers Chidwick and Rainey, by finding that each of them had bought half a dozen sets of boxing gloves and encouraged their crews in boxing. When I was police commissioner, I heartily approved the effort to get boxing clubs started in New York on a clean basis. Later, I was reluctantly obliged to come to the conclusion that the prize ring had become hopelessly debased and demoralized, and as governor I aided in the passage of and signed the bill putting a stop to professional boxing for money. This was because some of the prize fighters themselves were crooked, while the crowd of hangers-on who attended and made up and profited by the matches had placed the whole business on a basis of commercialism and brutality that was intolerable. I shall always maintain that boxing contests themselves make good, healthy sport. It is idle to compare them with bullfighting. The torture and death of the wretched horses in bullfighting is enough of itself to blast the sport, no matter how great the skill and prowess shown by the bullfighters. Any sport in which the death and torture of animals is made to furnish pleasure to the spectators is debasing. There should always be the opportunity provided in a glove fight or bare fist fight to stop it when one competitor is hopelessly outclassed or too badly hammered. But the men who take part in these fights are hard as nails, and it is not worthwhile to feel sentimental about their receiving punishment, which, as a matter of fact, they do not mind. Of course, the men who look on ought to be able to stand up with the gloves, or without them, themselves. I have scant use for the type of sportsmanship which consists merely in looking on at the feats of someone else. Some as good citizens as I know are or were prize fighters. Take Mike Donovan, of New York. He and his family represent a type of American citizenship of which we have a right to be proud. Mike is a devoted temperance man, and can be relied upon for every movement in the interest of good citizenship. I was first intimately thrown with him when I was police commissioner. On evening he and I, both in dress suits, attended a temperance meeting of Catholic societies. It culminated in a lively set-to between myself and a Tammany senator, who was a very good fellow, but whose ideas of temperance differed radically from mine, and, as the event proved, from those of the majority of the meeting. Mike evidently regarded himself as my backer. He was sitting on the platform beside me, and I think felt as pleased and interested as if the set-to had been physical instead of merely verbal. Afterward I grew to know him well both while I was governor and while I was president, and many a time he came on and boxed with me. battling Nelson was another stanch friend, and he and I think alike on most questions of political and industrial life. Although he once expressed to me some commiseration because, as president, I didn't get anything like the money returned for my services that he aggregated during the same term of years in the ring. Bob Fitzsimmons was another good friend of mine. He has nearly forgotten his early skill as a blacksmith, and among the things that I value and always keep in use is a penholder made by Bob out of a horseshoe, with an inscription saying that it is made for and presented to President Theodore Roosevelt by his friend and admirer, Robert Fitzsimmons. I have for a long time had the friendship of John L. Sullivan, than whom in his prime no better man ever stepped into the ring. He is now a Massachusetts farmer. John used occasionally to visit me at the White House, his advent always causing a distinct flutter among the waiting senators and congressmen. When I went to Africa, he presented me with a gold-mounted rabbit's foot for luck. I carried it through my African trip, and I certainly had good luck. On one occasion, one of my prize-fighting friends called on me at the White House on business. He explained that he wished to see me alone, sat down opposite me, and put a very expensive cigar on the desk, saying, "Have a cigar." I thanked him and said I did not smoke, to which he responded, "Put it in your pocket." He then added, "Take another. Put both in your pocket." This I accordingly did. Having thus shown at the outset the necessary formal courtesy, my visitor, an old and valued friend, proceeded to explain that a nephew of his had enlisted in the Marine Corps, but had been absent without leave, and was threatened with dishonorable discharge on the ground of desertion. My visitor, a good citizen and a patriotic American, was stung to the quick at the thought of such an incident occurring in his family, and he explained to me that it must not occur, that there must not be the disgrace to the family, although he would be delighted to have the offender handled rough to teach him a needed lesson. He added that he wished he would take him and handle him himself, for he knew that I would see that he got all that was coming to him. Then a look of pathos came into his eyes, and he explained, "That boy I just cannot understand. He was my sister's favorite son, and I always took a special interest in him myself. I did my best to bring him up the way he ought to go, but there was just nothing to be done with him. His tastes were naturally low. He took to music." What form this debasing taste for music assumed I did not inquire, and I was able to grant my friend's wish. While in the White House, I always tried to get a couple hours' exercise in the afternoons, sometimes tennis, more often riding, or else a rough cross-country walk, perhaps down Rock Creek, which was then as wild as a stream in the White Mountains, or on the Virginian side of the Potomac. My companions at tennis, or on these rides and walks, we gradually grew to style the tennis cabinet, and then we extended the term to take in many of my old-time Western friends, such as Ben Daniels, Seth Bullock, Luther Kelly, and others who had taken part with me in more serious outdoor adventures than walking and riding for pleasure. Most of the men who were oftenest with me on these trips, men like Major General Leonard Wood, or Major General Thomas Berry, or Presley Marion Rixey, Surgeon General of the Navy, or Robert Bacon, who was afterwards Secretary of State, or James Garfield, who was Secretary of the Interior, or Gifford Pinchot, who was Chief of the Forest Service, were better men physically than I was, but I could ride and walk well enough for us all thoroughly to enjoy it. Often, especially in the winters and early springs, we would arrange for a point-to-point walk, not turning aside for anything, for instance, swimming Rock Creek or even the Potomac if it came in our way. Of course, under such circumstances, we had to arrange that our return to Washington should be when it was dark, so that our appearance might scandalize no one. On several occasions, we thus swam Rock Creek in the early spring when the ice was floating thick upon it. If we swam the Potomac, we usually took off our clothes. I remember one such occasion when the French ambassador, Jusserand, who was member of the tennis cabinet, was along, and just as we were about to get in to swim, somebody said, Mr. Ambassador, you haven't taken off your gloves." To which he promptly responded, "I think I will leave them on. We might meet ladies." We liked Rock Creek for these walks because we could do so much scrambling and climbing along the cliffs. There was almost as much climbing when we walked down the Potomac to Washington from the Virginia end of the chain bridge. I would occasionally take some big game friend from abroad, Sealou's or St. George Littledale, or Captain Radcliffe, or Paul Nidick, on these walks. Once I invited an entire class of officers who were attending lectures at the War College to come on one of these walks. I chose a route which gave us the hardest climbing along the rocks and the deepest crossing of the creek, and my army friends enjoyed it hugely, being the right sort to a man. On March 1st, 1909, 3 days before leaving the presidency, various members of the tennis cabinet lunched with me at the White House. Tennis cabinet was an elastic term, and of course many who ought to have been at the lunch were, for one reason or another, away from Washington. But to make up for this, a goodly number of out-of-town honorary members, so to speak, were present. For instance, Seth Bullock, Luther Kelly, better known as Yellowstone Kelly in the days when he was an army scout against the Sioux, and Abernathy, the wolf hunter. At the end of lunch, Seth Bullock suddenly reached forward, swept aside a mass of flowers which made a centerpiece on the table, and revealed a bronze cougar by Proctor, which was a parting gift to me. The lunch party and the cougar were then photographed on the lawn. Some of the younger officers, who were my constant companions on these walks and rides, pointed out to me the condition of utter physical worthlessness into which certain of the elder ones had permitted themselves to lapse, and the very bad effect this would certainly have if ever the army were called into service. I then looked into the matter for myself, and was really shocked at what I found. Many of the older officers were so unfit physically that their condition would have excited laughter, had it not been so serious to think that they belonged to the military arm of the government. A cavalry colonel proved unable to keep his horse at a smart trot for even half a mile when I visited his post. A major general proved afraid even to let his horse canter when he went on a ride with us, and certain otherwise good men proved as unable to walk as if they had been sedentary brokers. I consulted with men like Major Generals Wood and Bell, who were themselves of fine physique, with bodies fit to meet any demand. It was late in my administration, and we deemed it best only to make a beginning. Experience teaches the most inveterate reformer how hard it is to get a totally non-military nation to accept seriously any military improvement. Accordingly, I merely issued directions that each officer should prove his ability to walk 50 miles or ride 100 in 3 days. This is, of course, a test which many a healthy middle-aged woman would be able to meet, but a large portion of the press adopted the view that it was a bit of capricious tyranny on my part, and a considerable number of elderly officers with desk rather than field experience intrigued with their friends in Congress to have the order annulled. So one day I took a ride of a little over 100 miles myself, in company with Surgeon General Rixey and 2 other officers. The Virginia roads were frozen and in ruts, and in the afternoon and evening there was a storm of snow and sleet. And when it had been thus experimentally shown, under unfavorable conditions, how easy it was to do in 1 day the task for which the army officers were allowed 3 days, all open objection ceased. But some bureau chiefs still did as much underhanded work against the order as they dared, and it was often difficult to reach them. In the Marine Corps, Captain Leonard, who had lost an arm at Tientsin, with 2 of his lieutenants did the 50 miles in 1 day, for they were vigorous young men who laughed at the idea of treating a 50-mile walk as over-fatiguing. Well, the Navy Department officials rebuked them, and made them take the walk over again in 3 days on the ground that taking it in 1 day did not comply with the regulations. This seems unbelievable, but Leonard assures me it is true. He did not inform me at the time, being afraid to get in wrong with his permanent superiors. If I had known of the order, short work would have been made of the bureaucrat who issued it. One of our best naval officers sent me the following letter, after the above had appeared. I note in your autobiography now being published in the Outlook that you may refer to the reasons which led you to establish a physical test for the Army, and to the action you took, your 100-mile ride, to prevent the test being abolished. Doubtless you did not know the following facts. 1. The first annual Navy test of 50 miles in 3 days was subsequently reduced to 25 miles in 2 days in each quarter. 2. This was further reduced to 10 miles each month, which is the present test, and there is danger lest even this utterly insufficient test be abolished. I enclose a copy of a recent letter to the Surgeon General, which will show our present deplorable condition and the worse condition into which we are slipping back. The original test of 50 miles in 3 days did a very great deal of good work. It decreased by thousands of dollars the money expended on streetcar fare, and by a much greater sum the amount expended over the bar. It eliminated a number of the wholly unfit. It taught officers to walk. It forced them to learn the care of their feet and that of their men. And it improved their general health and was rapidly forming a taste for physical exercise. The enclosed letter ran in the part as follows. I am returning under separate cover, The Soldier's Foot and the Military Shoe. The book contains knowledge of a practical character that is valuable for the men who have to march, who have suffered from foot troubles, and who must avoid them in order to attain efficiency. The words in capitals express, according to my idea, the gist of the whole matter as regards military men. The army officer whose breakdown on the test gets a black eye. The one whose men show efficiency in this respect gets a bouquet. To such men the book is invaluable. There is no danger that they will neglect it. They will actually learn it, for exactly the same reason that our fellows learned the gunnery instructions, or did learn them before they were withdrawn and burned. But I have not been able to interest a single naval officer in this fine book. They will look at the pictures and say it is a good book, but they won't read it. The marine officers, on the contrary, are very much interested because they have to teach men to care for their feet, and they must know how to care for their own. But the naval officers feel no such necessity, simply because their men do not have to demonstrate their efficiency by practice marches, and they themselves do not have to do a stunt that will show up their own ignorance and inefficiency in the matter. For example, some time ago I was talking with some chaps about shoes, the necessity of having them long enough and wide enough, etc., and one of them said, I have no use for such shoes, as I never walk except when I have to, and any old shoes do for the 10-mile-a-month stunt. So there you are. When the first test was ordered, Edmonston, Washington shoe man, told me that he sold more real walking shoes to naval officers in 3 months than he had in the 3 preceding years. I know 3 officers who lost big toenails after the first test, and another who walked 9 miles in practice with a pair of heavy walking shoes that were too small and was laid up for 3 days. Could not come to the office. I know plenty of men who, after the first test, had to borrow shoes from larger men until their feet went down to their normal size. This test may have been a bit strenuous for old hearts, of men who had never taken any exercise, but it was excellent as a matter of instruction and training of handling feet, and in any emergency, such as we soon may have in Mexico, sound hearts are not much good if the feet won't stand. However, the 25-mile test in 2 days each quarter answered the same purpose, for the reason that 12.5 miles will produce sore feet with bad shoes, and sore feet and lame muscles even with good shoes, if there has been no practice marching. It was the necessity of doing 12.5 more miles on the second day with sore feet and lame muscles that made 'em sit up and take notice, made 'em practice walking, made 'em avoid streetcars, buy proper shoes, show some curiosity about socks and the care of the feet in general. All this passed out with the introduction of the last test of 10 miles a month. As one fellow said, I can do that in sneakers, but he couldn't if the second day involved a tramp on the sore feet. The point is that whereas formerly officers had to practice walking a bit and give some attention to proper footgear, now they don't have to, and their natural consequence is that they don't do it. There are plenty of officers who do not walk any more than is necessary, to which a streetcar that will carry them from their residences to their offices. Some who have motors do not do so much. They take no exercise. They take cocktails instead and are getting beefy and paunchy. And something should be done to remedy this state of affairs. It would not be necessary if service opinion required officers so to order their lives that it would be common knowledge that they were hard in order to avoid the danger of being selected out. We have no such service opinion, and it is in the process of formation. On the contrary, it is known that the principal dignitaries unanimously advised the Secretary to abandon all physical tests. He, a civilian, was wise enough not to take the advice. I would like to see a test established that would oblige officers to take sufficient exercise to pass it without inconvenience, For the reasons given above, 20 miles in 2 days every other month would do the business, while 10 miles each month does not touch it, simply because nobody has to walk on next day feet. As for the proposed test of so many hours exercise a week, the flatfoots of the pendulous belly muscles are delighted. They are looking into the question of pedometers, and will hang one of these on their wheezy chests, and let it count every shuffling step they take out of doors. If we had an adequate test throughout 20 years, there would at the end of that time be few if any sacks of blubber at the upper end of the list, and service opinion against the sort of thing would be established. These tests were kept during my administration. They were afterwards abandoned, not through perversity or viciousness, but through weakness and inability to understand the need of preparedness in advance, if the emergencies of war are to be properly met, when or if they arrive. In no country with an army worth calling such is there a chance for a man physically unfit to stay in the service. Our countrymen should understand that every army officer and every marine officer ought to be summarily removed from the service unless he is able to undergo far severer tests than those which, as a beginning, I imposed. To follow any other course is to put a premium on slothful incapacity, and to do the gravest wrong to the nation. I have mentioned all these experiences, and I could mention scores of others, because out of them grew my philosophy. Perhaps they were in part caused by my philosophy of bodily vigor as a method of getting that vigor of soul without which vigor of the body counts for nothing. The dweller in cities has less chance than the dweller in the country to keep his body sound and vigorous, but he can do so, if only he will take the trouble. Any young lawyer, shopkeeper, or clerk, or shop assistant can keep himself in good condition if he tries. Some of the best men who have ever served under me in the National Guard and in my regiment were former clerks or floor walkers. Why, Johnny Hayes, the marathon victor, and at one time world champion, one of my valued friends and supporters, was a floor walker in Bloomingdale's big department store. Surely, with Johnny Hayes as an example, any young man in a city can hope to make his body all that a vigorous man's body should be. I once made a speech to which I gave the title, The Strenuous Life. Afterwards I published a volume of essays with this for a title. There were 2 translations of it, which always especially pleased me. One was by a Japanese officer who knew English well, and who had carried the essay all through the Manchurian campaign, and later translated it for the benefit of his countrymen. The other was by an Italian lady, whose brother, an officer in the Italian army, who had died on duty in a foreign land, had also greatly liked the article and carried it round with him. In translating the title, the lady rendered it in Italian as Vigor di vita. I thought this translation a great improvement on the original, and, having always wished that I had myself used the vigor of life as a heading to indicate what I was trying to preach, instead of the heading I actually did use. There are 2 kinds of success, or rather 2 kinds of ability displayed in the achievement of success. There is, first, the success either in big things or small things, which comes to a man who has in him the natural power to do what no one else can do, and comes to the man who has in him, and what no amount of training, no perseverance or willpower, will enable any ordinary man to do. This success, of course, like every other kind of success, may be on a very big scale or on a small scale. The quality which the man possesses may be that which enables him to run 100 yards in 9 3/5 seconds, or to play 10 separate games of chess at the same time blindfolded, or to add 5 columns of figures at once without effort, or to write the Ode to a Grecian Urn, or to deliver the Gettysburg speech, or to show the ability of Frederick at Leuthen, or Nelson at Trafalgar. No amount of training of body or mind would enable any good ordinary man to perform any of these feats. Of course, the proper performance of each implies much previous study or training, but in no one of them is success to be attained by the altogether exceptional man who has in him the something additional which the ordinary man does not have. This is the most striking kind of success, and it can be attained only by the man who has in him the quality which separates him in kind no less than in degree from his fellows, but much the commoner type of success in every walk of life and in every species of effort in that which comes to the man who differs from his fellows not by the kind of quality which he possesses, but by the degree of development which he has given that quality. This kind of success is open to a large number of persons, if only they seriously determine to achieve it. It is the kind of success which is open to the average man of sound body and fair mind, who has no remarkable mental or physical attributes, but who gets just as much as possible in the way of work out of the aptitudes that he does possess. It is the only kind of success that is open to most of us, yet some of the greatest successes in history have been those of this second class. When I call it second class, I am not running it down in the least. I am merely pointing out that it differs in kind from the first class. To the average man, it is probably more useful to study this second type of success than to study the first. From the study of the first, he can learn inspiration. He can get uplift and lofty enthusiasm. From the study of the second, he can, if he chooses, find out how to win a similar success himself. I need hardly say that all the successes I have ever won have been of the second type. I never won anything without hard labor and the exercise of my best judgment and careful planning and working long in advance. Having been a rather sickly and awkward boy, I was, as a young man, at first both nervous and distrustful of my own prowess. I had to train myself painfully and laboriously, not merely as regards my body, but as regards my soul and spirit. When a boy, I read a passage in one of Marryat's books, which always impressed me. In this passage, the captain of a small British man-of-war is explaining to the hero how to acquire the qualities of fearlessness. He says that at the outset almost every man is frightened when he goes into action, but that the course to follow is for the man to keep such a grip on himself that he can act just as if he was not frightened. After this is kept up long enough, it changes from pretense to reality, and the man does in very fact become fearless by sheer dint of practicing fearlessness when he does not feel it. I am using my own language, not Marryat's. This was the theory upon which I went. There were all kinds of things of which I was afraid at first, ranging from grizzly bears to mean horses and gunfighters. But by acting as if I was not afraid, I gradually ceased to be afraid. Most men can have the same experience if they choose. They will first learn to bear themselves well in trials which they anticipate and which they school themselves in advance to meet. After a while, the habit will grow on them, and they will behave well in sudden and unexpected emergencies which come upon them unawares. It is, of course, much pleasanter if one is naturally fearless, and I envy and respect the men who are naturally fearless. But it is a good thing to remember that the man who does not enjoy this advantage can nevertheless stand beside the man who does, and can do his duty with the like efficiency, if he chooses. Of course, he must not let his desire take the form merely of a daydream. Let him dream about being a fearless man, and the more he dreams, the better he will be, always provided he does his best to realize the dream in practice. He can do his part honorably, and well provided only he sets fearlessness before himself as an ideal, schools himself to think of danger merely as something to be faced and overcome, and regards life itself as he should regard it, not as something to be thrown away, but as a pawn to be promptly hazarded, whenever the hazard is warranted by the larger interests of the great game in which we are all engaged.